A nurse is running. She does not know yet that this moment will be repeated for the rest of her life, in every telling of this story, for thousands of years. She only knows that the house is falling apart, that men are dying, that the kingdom her family served has collapsed in a single afternoon on a mountain called Gilboa. She has one job left in the world. There is a 5-year-old boy in her arms, and she has to get him out. She is not careless. She is terrified. And terror does something to the body that carefulness cannot always undo. In her hurry, she stumbles. The boy falls. He will never walk without a limp again. Jonathan, son of Saul, had a son who was lame in both feet. He was 5 years old when the news about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel. His nurse picked him up and fled. But as she hurried to leave, he fell and became crippled. His name was Mephibosheth. 2 Samuel 4:4. Most people who know this story skip past that verse. It reads like a footnote, a small detail tucked into a chapter about assassinations and palace intrigue. But stop here for a moment, because this sentence is the hinge the entire story turns on. A 5-year-old boy did not choose his grandfather's failures. He did not choose the war that killed his father. He did not choose the nurse's fear, or her stumble, or the injury that would define the rest of his life. Everything that happens to him for years afterward, the hiding, the poverty, the shame, begins with an accident he had no part in. And here is the detail almost no one notices. Even his name was not fully his own. His birth name was Baal. Baal contends, or Baal is my advocate. But Baal was the name of a rival god, and the scribes who recorded this history would not let that name stand, even by accident. So they replaced it. Baal became Mephibosheth, and Bosheth means shame. The name we know him by is not incidental. It is a scar, deliberately written in, a constant reminder of disgrace hung on a boy who had done nothing to deserve it. That is where this story actually starts. Not with a battle, not with a throne, with a boy who was broken before he ever had the chance to choose anything for himself, carrying a name that spoke shame over him before he ever spoke a word himself. Keep that in view, because everything that happens next is going to answer a question this opening scene raises without ever asking it out loud. What happens to a person who has been shaped entirely by things outside their control? To understand where this story goes, we need to understand where it stops for years. A place named Lo Debar. After the fall of Saul's house, Mephibosheth is not raised in a palace. He is not trained for the throne he might have inherited. He disappears into hiding, into the household of a man named Machir, in a place whose very name tells you what kind of place it was. He is at the house of Machir, son of Amiel, in Lo Debar. 2 Samuel 9:4. That name means, essentially, no pasture. Nothing. A place with nothing growing in it. No green, no provision, no promise. It is not simply an obscure village. It is a place chosen, whether consciously or not, because it was the kind of place no one would think to look. If you wanted to disappear from a kingdom that might still want you dead, you went somewhere that offered nothing, because nothing draws no attention. This is where a grandson of a king spends his growing up years, dependent entirely on someone else's household, someone else's roof, someone else's mercy. So King David had him brought from Lo Debar, from the house of Machir, son of Amiel. 2 Samuel 9:5. Notice what he does not have. No land of his own, no income of his own, no protection of his own. Everything he has because another man chose to give him shelter. He is not simply poor. He is entirely, completely dependent. The kind of dependency that leaves no room for pride, because there is nothing to be proud of. This is the table this story keeps circling back to. But at this point in the story, there is no table at all. There is only a barren house in a barren place, and a man who has learned to expect nothing, because nothing is what the world has given him since the day he fell from his nurse's arms. Hold that image. A boy in a place called nothing. Because in a very short while, this story is going to place him at the most honored table in the entire kingdom. And the distance between those two places is going to become the whole point. The story moves because of a question David asks, A question that, on its surface, sounds like simple curiosity, but underneath it carries an entire covenant. David is now firmly established as king. Saul is dead. Jonathan is dead. By every normal rule of ancient kingship, any surviving members of the previous royal line were threats to be eliminated, not guests to be honored. Rival claimants to a throne were rarely shown mercy. They were usually shown a sword. So when David asks his question, it goes against everything a king in his position was expected to do. He remembers a promise. Long before any of this, before the crown, before the war, before Saul's jealousy turned lethal, David and Jonathan had made a covenant with each other, a bond of loyalty that was meant to outlast both of them. David has not forgotten it. A servant named Ziba is brought forward, and the search begins. He is at the house of Machir, son of Ammiel, in Lo Debar, 2 Samuel 9:4. David sends for him. So King David had him brought from Lo Debar, from the house of Machir, son of Ammiel. 2 Samuel 9:5. Try to imagine what that summons must have felt like from the inside. A crippled man, raised on charity, hidden away his entire adult life from the family that now sat on the throne, suddenly told the king wants to see him. There is no version of that news that sounds safe. Every instinct trained by years of hiding would say, this is the end. When Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David, he bowed down to pay him honor. David said, Mephibosheth. Your servant, he replied. Don't be afraid, David said to him, for I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table. 2 Samuel 9:6-7. Notice the first words out of David's mouth. Don't be afraid. Before any promise is spoken, before any land is restored, the fear itself is addressed directly. David sees the terror behind the bow, and he speaks to it before he speaks to anything else. Then comes the response, a response that tells you everything about how this man had learned to see himself. What is your servant, that you should notice a dead dog like me? 2 Samuel 9:8. That is not false humility. That is the honest self-assessment of a man who has spent his whole life being nothing, in a place called nothing, and has never once been given a reason to think otherwise. David does not argue with him. He simply acts. I have given your master's grandson everything that belonged to Saul and his family. You and your sons and your servants are to farm the land for him and bring in the crops, so that your master's grandson may be provided for. And Mephibosheth, grandson of your master, will always eat at my table. 2 Samuel 9:9-10. And then the outcome, stated plainly, twice, so we do not miss it. So Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. He always ate at the king's table, and he was crippled in both feet. 2 Samuel 9:11. 13. That last phrase is left in on purpose. The text does not erase his disability once he is restored. He sits at the king's table, and he is still crippled in both feet. The healing here is not physical. It is a healing of position, of belonging, of identity. The legs never change. Everything else does. There is also a detail easy to miss in how this restoration was structured. David did not simply hand Mephibosheth a title and leave him to manage his own affairs. He assigned an entire household, Ziba, his sons, his servants, to farm the land and bring in the harvest, so that a man who could not work the fields himself would still be fully provided for. The kindness was not a one-time gesture. It was a standing arrangement, built to last for the rest of Mephibosheth's life. Grace, here, is not a moment. It becomes a structure someone lives inside. There is an older story that this one quietly echoes. Not a story about a person, but about an entire people, found by God in a condition not so different from Mephibosheth's own. In a desert land he found him, in a barren and howling waste. He shielded him and cared for him. He guarded him as the apple of his eye. Deuteronomy 32:10. A barren waste, a place with nothing in it. Sound familiar? Long before there was a Lo Debar, there was a desert where God found a people who had nothing, and he did not simply rescue them and move on. He guarded them the way you guard the most precious, most vulnerable part of your own body. This is not a coincidence of language. It is a pattern. God has always been in the business of finding people in barren places and refusing to leave them there. If this whole story had to be compressed into a single sentence, it would be this one. What is your servant, that you should notice a dead dog like me? 2 Samuel 9. Sit with that phrase for a moment, because it is doing more work than it first appears to. Mephibosheth is not simply describing his social status. He is describing his sense of worth. A dead dog is not just a low creature. It is a worthless one, something with no use, no value, nothing to offer. That is how this man had come to see himself after a lifetime shaped by an accident he never chose, and a name that spoke shame before he ever opened his mouth. This is the miniature that contains the whole story. Because almost everyone watching this has, at some point, said some version of that sentence about themselves. Maybe not out loud, maybe not in those exact words, but in the quiet places where we measure our own worth against what we believe we deserve. What is your servant, that you should notice someone like me? And this is exactly where the mirror widens. Because this is not only Mephibosheth's story. This is the story of anyone who has been shaped by something outside their control. A fall they did not cause, a name attached to them by circumstance, a place they were hidden in because it felt safer than being seen. The specific details change from person to person. The shape of the story does not. David's answer to that self-assessment was not a debate. He did not try to talk Mephibosheth out of feeling worthless with better arguments. He simply gave him a seat, a table, and a place among sons. The action itself became the answer. Notice, too, that Mephibosheth never once corrects his own self-description. He does not argue back that he is actually worth something. He accepts the kindness while still holding on to the language of worthlessness, and the story lets that stand. It does not require him to first believe he is valuable before he can be treated as valuable. The treatment comes first. Belief, if it comes at all, comes after, slowly, the way it usually does for anyone who has spent years believing the worst about themselves. Now watch how this single story, from centuries before Christ, becomes a map for something much larger. Start with the ache of what could have been. There is a verse spoken generations later to a whole nation that had wandered from what it was given, and it carries the same sorrow you can hear underneath Mephibosheth's own broken self-image, the sense of a peace that was possible and lost. If only you had paid attention to my commands, your peace would have been like a river, your righteousness like the waves of the sea. Isaiah 48:18. A crippled man in a barren house. A people who could have had peace like a river and did not. Both stories carry the same undertone. Something was lost that did not have to be lost. Mephibosheth's crippled feet were not his fault, but the years of hiding, the years of believing himself worthless, the years spent in Lo Debar rather than at any table at all. That separation carries the shape of something the New Testament calls slavery. Not slavery to a person, but slavery to a condition you were born into and never chose. Now Hagar stands for Mount Sinai in Arabia and corresponds to the present city of Jerusalem, because she is in slavery with her children. Galatians 4:25. That is Lo Debar in another form, a lineage, a condition, a place of bondage passed down rather than chosen. But the story does not end in slavery. But the Jerusalem that is above is free, and she is our mother. Galatians 4:26. Notice the movement. Not earned freedom, inherited freedom, the same way Mephibosheth did not earn his seat at David's table. It was given because of a covenant made long before he was ever born, a covenant between David and his father Jonathan. He inherited kindness the same way he had once inherited exile. This is where the story of a name built around shame meets its answer. Before Mephibosheth ever spoke a single word of explanation or defense, David had already decided to show him kindness. The mercy came first. The word came after. That order matters, because it is exactly the order Scripture describes for anyone who has ever felt like a dead dog, unworthy of notice. made us alive with Christ even when we were dead in transgressions. It is by grace you have been saved. Ephesians 2:5. Lo Debar, no pasture, nothing, a barren place with no life growing in it, becomes the picture of exactly this condition. Dead. Not struggling toward life, not almost alive. Dead. The way Mephibosheth's future looked dead the day he fell from his nurse's arms. And into that deadness, the exact same kind of movement that carried David out to Lo Debar to bring a broken man home. For it is by grace you have been saved, through faith, and this not from yourselves, it is the gift of God. Ephesians 2:8. Not from yourselves, not earned, not worked for. A gift, the way land and a permanent seat at a king's table were a gift to a man who owned nothing and had nothing to offer in return. Think again about what Mephibosheth actually brought to that meeting with David. He brought fear. He brought a lifetime of hiding. He brought a body that could not walk without help, and a self-image shaped entirely by what had been done to him rather than what he had done. He did not bring qualifications. He did not bring an argument for why he deserved kindness. He brought nothing but his own presence, trembling, bowed low, waiting for a sentence rather than a gift. And it was precisely into that emptiness that the gift was given. That is the shape grace always takes. It does not wait for us to arrive with something to offer. It meets us in Lo Debar, before we have anything at all. And this is not an isolated act of kindness from David alone. It reflects something true about the character of God himself, described plainly in the New Testament. But love your enemies, do good to them, and lend to them without expecting to get anything back. Then your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High, because he is kind to the ungrateful and wicked. Luke 6:35. Kind to the ungrateful, kind to the wicked. Kind, the text will not let us miss the word, for no reason found in the one receiving it. Mephibosheth did nothing to earn David's kindness. He simply received it, seated where he had never expected to sit, in a place he had never imagined belonged to him. Which brings us to the last thread, the response of someone who has actually understood what they have been given. But I, by your great mercy, will come into your house. In reverence will I bow down toward your holy temple. Psalm 5:7. Not into your house because I earned an invitation, because of your great mercy. That is the only door anyone has ever walked through into God's presence. Not merit, but mercy. The same mercy that carried a message out to a barren place called nothing and said, "Come home and eat at the table." Somewhere, right now, someone watching this is living in their own version of Lo Debar. Maybe it is not a physical place. Maybe it is a season, a long stretch of feeling forgotten. Feeling like whatever happened to shape your life was never something you chose, carrying a name or a label or a story about yourself that feels more like a scar than an identity. Maybe you have said your own version of that sentence. What is your servant? That you should notice someone like me, quietly, to no one, more times than you would ever admit out loud. Here is what this story wants you to see. The distance between Lo Debar and the king's table was never something Mephibosheth closed himself. He could not have. He had no land, no strength, no standing, nothing to offer in exchange for what he received. The distance was closed by someone else's decision to remember a covenant and to act on it before Mephibosheth ever said a word in his own defense. That is the same door that stands open right now. Not because of what you have done, not because of what happened to you, or what was taken from you, or what you have believed about yourself in the years since, but because mercy went looking, the same way David sent for a man hiding in a barren house and said, "Don't be afraid. There is a place for you, and you will always eat at my table." If this passage opens something up for you, leave one word in the comments: table, mercy, or grace, whichever one landed the deepest as you watched. And if this kind of study helps you see Scripture more clearly, subscribe for more Bible stories and studies made simple. May the Lord help us not only understand this story, but believe it is true for us, that we are not forgotten in Lo Debar, but called, by mercy, to the table. God bless you.